Before the Falklands War began, the consensus of the world's air forces regarding the Sea Harrier was clear and largely correct. It was a short-range, carrier-based aircraft with a maximum speed that could not match the fastest fighters it was likely to encounter, a radar that was competent for the maritime patrol role and underpowered for the air superiority role, and an airframe that had been designed around the requirements of operating from small carriers rather than the requirements of defeating modern fighter aircraft in close combat. The consensus was that it was a second-tier combat aircraft capable of performing useful but not decisive roles in a high-intensity conflict. Within 10 weeks of the war's beginning, that consensus was destroyed by a kill ratio that nobody in the world's air forces had predicted, and that most of them spent the following decade trying to understand correctly. The Sea Harrier destroyed 21 Argentine aircraft in air-to-air combat during the Falklands campaign. It lost 0 aircraft to air-to-air engagement. In a conflict where the Argentine Air Force was operating aircraft that were, by the conventional metrics of speed, climb rate, and sustained turning performance, competitive with or superior to the Sea Harrier in specific regimes, that outcome required an explanation that went beyond the aircraft's own performance characteristics. The explanation that most air forces eventually settled on was that the Falklands had not been primarily a test of aircraft performance. It had been a test of missile capability, radar control doctrine, and the institutional intelligence failures that prevented one side from understanding what it was actually fighting until the engagement record had established the answer empirically. The Argentine Air Force that went to war in April 1982 was a professional and capable organization. Its pilots were well trained, its aircraft were modern and well maintained for the Argentine military's resource base, and its attack planning demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the tactical challenges involved in striking defended naval targets at extreme range from mainland bases. The A-4 Skyhawk force that conducted the bulk of the anti-shipping strikes was flying aircraft that required maximum external fuel loads to reach the Falklands with any time over target, fuel loads that reduced maneuverability and meant that any aircraft that engaged in sustained air combat on the way in would not have the fuel to complete the mission and return. The Argentine Air Force accepted this constraint and built its attack tactics around it. Pilots were instructed to execute their attack runs and exit as rapidly as possible, minimizing exposure to air defense and avoiding air combat engagement if at all possible. The prioritization was correct, given the range constraint. It meant that Argentine pilots over the Falklands were consistently in a position where their fuel state prevented them from making the best defensive decisions, because the best defensive decision was often to turn and fight, and the fuel to turn and fight was not available. This constraint was understood by Argentine planners and accepted as an unavoidable feature of the operational geography. What was not adequately understood was the nature of the air defense weapon they would be facing when they flew their attack profiles. The briefings that Argentine pilots received before the campaign on the Sea Harrier's armament described the aircraft as carrying Sidewinder missiles. The briefings did not adequately convey the specific capability difference between the Sidewinder variants that the Argentine Air Force had studied and the AIM-9L variant that the Sea Harriers were actually carrying. The distinction was not technical arcana, it was the central tactical fact of the air defense equation. Earlier Sidewinder variants were rear-aspect weapons. The AIM-9L was all-aspect. The defensive maneuver that a trained pilot executed against a rear-aspect missile, the hard turn into the attacker, converting the attacker's pursuit geometry into a head-on approach that the missile's infrared seeker could not track, was the correct response to one weapon and the wrong response to the other. Against the AIM-9L, turning toward the attacker placed the target in a geometry that the missile's all-aspect seeker could acquire and track. The Argentine pilots who executed the trained defensive maneuver against Sea Harriers were executing the maneuver that the missile had been designed to defeat. How this intelligence gap developed and persisted into the campaign is a question that the Argentine Air Force's post-war analysis addressed, with the honest recognition that the failure was institutional rather than individual. The AIM-9L had been in service with U.S. forces and had been procured by the British several years before the Falklands campaign. Its all-aspect capability was not a secret. The technical specifications were available in open sources. The distinction between the L variant and earlier versions was documented in aviation reference material that Argentine intelligence analysts had access to. What failed was the process by which that information was translated into tactical briefing material and then into revised procedures that pilots could apply in combat. The chain of analysis, assessment, revision, and training that should have identified the AIM-9L's all-aspect capability as a critical planning assumption and produced modified defensive procedures was not completed before the first aircraft was lost. By the time the all-aspect capability was empirically confirmed through the pattern of engagements, The campaign was already deep into its air combat phase, and the procedural changes that might have reduced losses were competing with the operational tempo of an ongoing war for the time and attention required to implement them. The Sea Harrier pilots who were achieving the engagement geometries that the AIM-9L required were not doing so through raw aircraft performance. They were being vectored onto their targets by a shipborne radar control network that provided situational awareness the aircraft's own Blue Fox radar could not consistently generate. The Type 42 destroyers and other radar-equipped ships in the task force were tracking incoming Argentine raids, assessing the composition and direction of the threats, and directing the Sea Harrier combat air patrol sections onto intercept headings that positioned the Harriers advantageously before the Argentine pilots were aware they were being engaged. The Sea Harrier was, in this operational architecture, functioning as the terminal delivery system for a weapon that the radar control network was positioning for optimum employment. The aircraft's performance characteristics mattered less than the quality of the intercept geometry, and the intercept geometry was being produced by a system that extended well beyond the aircraft itself. This was the lesson that the world's air forces drew from the Falklands, with varying degrees of accuracy. The popular version of the lesson, that the Sea Harrier had proven a second-tier aircraft could defeat superior opponents through superior pilot skill, was the version that made for satisfying narrative and was largely wrong as an analysis. The accurate version, that the AIM-9L in combination with radar control had produced engagement geometries in which conventional aircraft performance parameters were less decisive than weapons capability and system-level situational awareness, was the version that shaped procurement decisions in the following decade. The investment that major air forces made in beyond visual range missile capability, in airborne early warning aircraft, in data link systems that allowed ground and airborne radar to share targeting data with the intercept aircraft, was informed by the Falklands analysis. The FA-18, the Eurofighter, the operational development of the AWACS as a tactical control platform. All of these developments reflect the understanding that the Falklands had reinforced about what actually determines air combat outcomes in a high-intensity conflict. The Argentine Air Force's performance in the anti-shipping role was, by any objective assessment, impressive given the constraints it was operating under. The pilots who flew their Skyhawks and daggers and Mirages against the British task force were doing so at ranges that required maximum fuel states, against air defenses that included Sea Harriers, shipborne surface-to-air missiles, and close-range gun and missile systems, with bomb fuses that had not been correctly calibrated for low-level delivery, and that cost the Argentine Air Force a significant proportion of the damage its correctly fused bombs would have inflicted. The ships that Argentine bombs passed through without detonating, HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, HMS Coventry among the losses, and multiple near misses on other vessels, were ships that would have been at the bottom of the South Atlantic if the fuses had functioned as intended. The fusing failure, like the AIM-9L intelligence failure, was an institutional problem that had a specific origin in the procurement and training decisions made before the war, and that could not be corrected during the campaign at the pace the operational tempo required. The engagement on June 8, 1982, when 2 Sea Harriers intercepted 4 Skyhawks returning from the Bluff Cove attack and destroyed them with Sidewinders before the Argentine pilots could apply effective defense, was the sharpest and most complete expression of the dynamic that had been operating throughout the campaign. 4 aircraft against 2. The 4 had just completed a successful attack against targets that had cost 48 lives. They were transitioning from the attack profile to the egress, fuel state declining, focused on the return flight. The 2 were coming in from a vector the radar control ships had established, armed with a missile their targets had not been correctly briefed on, in a geometry that allowed missile employment before defensive maneuver was possible. The outcome was determined by the system, the radar, the missile, the training, the control, not by the raw comparison of 4 airframes against 2. The numbers that looked like an Argentine advantage were irrelevant to the engagement geometry. The engagement geometry was the only number that mattered. The Falklands Air War ended on June 14, 1982, when Argentine ground forces surrendered. The Royal Navy had lost 6 Sea Harriers during the campaign, none to air-to-air combat. All 6 were lost to ground fire and accidents. The Argentine Air Force had lost 21 aircraft to Sea Harrier Sidewinders alone, in addition to losses to surface-to-air missiles and guns. The ratio that the pre-war consensus had not predicted became the data point that the post-war analysis spent years explaining. The explanation, when the institutional ego of the Air Forces examining it was sufficiently managed to allow honest assessment, was not that the Sea Harrier was a better aircraft than the assessment had concluded. It was that the assessment had been measuring the wrong things. Aircraft performance parameters matter in a combat, where the engagement geometry is determined by aircraft performance. When the engagement geometry is determined by a radar control network and the terminal weapon is all aspect, aircraft performance is a secondary variable. The Falklands established that distinction empirically, at a cost measured in pilots and ships and 48 Welsh guardsmen at Bluff Cove. The lesson was clear. The clarity came at a price that makes the lesson difficult to examine with the detachment that analysis requires. But the analysis was done, and the procurement decisions and the doctrine changes that followed it are the record of what the world's air forces concluded. The Sea Harrier beat the Skyhawk. It beat it with a missile, and the missile beat it because nobody had told the Skyhawk pilots what the missile could do.